start by looking at some molecules, and we're going to identify whether they are acetals or hemiacetals. This is a skill that you need to have for quizzes and exams. It will also be helpful in biochemistry when we start looking at sugars, or when you start looking at sugars next semester. So if we look at this first molecule, we want to identify if it's a hemiacetal, an acetal, or neither. Remember, an acetal has a carbon that is attached to two OR groups, while a hemiacetal has a carbon that is attached to an OR and an OH. What we see here is a carbon chain, and now we look at this carbon right here. This carbon right here is also continues to a carbon on the carbon chain, but it's also attached to an OH and to an O that has a carbon chain, so this would be your OR. That means that this molecule is a hemiacetal, and I've circled the acetal carbon. This would be the acetal bond, and this would be the acetal bond. Recall, this is not an ether and this is not an alcohol. This is a hemiacetal. Now if we go on to the next molecule, it's quite similar to the first molecule. However, instead of our acetal carbon being attached to an OH at this position, it's attached to an OR. So this is what we would call a full-blown acetal. So we have our acetal carbon, an acetal bond to an OR, and an acetal bond to an OR. The next molecule, we have our carbon chain. Now we see that the carbon chain ends right here. This does not impact whether it's an acetal or a hemiacetal, but as we evaluate this, we look and we see we have our carbon, and it's attached to an OR and attached to another OR. This means that this is an acetal. Finally, this last molecule has a little bit of distraction on it. Right here we see that we have a ketone functional group. So we have a carbon double bonded to an O. This does not impact whether the molecule has an acetal or not. We just know that this position is not an acetal or a hemiacetal. If we look at this position here, where the carbon chain ends, we have an OH and an OR. So this will be our acetal carbon, and since we have an OH attached to the acetal carbon and an OR, we have a hemiacetal. This is our acetal bond, and this is our acetal bond.